Good morning, everyone. My name is Amber Ariano. As Kathy said, I'm the Executive Director of the Education Trust Midwest, and I'm really happy to have all of you here today. We have a lot of distinguished guests. Our President of the State Board of Education, the Governor's Office, Governor Rick Snyder's office is here this morning. Many business leaders, K-12 education leaders, so a warm welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. We're going to really spend the most of our morning in conversation with our guests this morning. And just to provide a little bit more context, I want to share a few slides before we introduce them and really get to it. I will ask several questions of them, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. And really, this is a day of learning. This is a day of candid conversation, and we want to allow you the floor for most of our time this morning to engage in a conversation. Like Ken, we're also a big fan of Good to Great, and that does mean, if you're familiar with that book, and that does mean that to really begin thinking about where we're going, we need to think about where we're starting from. And I want to provide a little bit of context about that. Today, Michigan is actually among the bottom states for a place where I think we've all agreed is an area for us to start when we think about making Michigan a top 10 education state. Governor Snyder, legislative leaders, the State Board of Education, many organizations, many leaders across the state have all now agreed on the vision, the metrics that we want to work toward is making Michigan a top 10 education state by 2030. But where do we start? That is a big, audacious goal, and so where do we start? And really where I think there's been sort of an unprecedented consensus just in the last year has been around starting with third grade reading. So let's start there today. Let's look at where we're doing and how we're doing on third grade reading compared to the rest of the country. So actually, Michigan is among the lower states in the country over the last decade when we look at the data on improvement. Now, this is not based on performance. This is actually just for improvement in early literacy. This is on what's called the NAEP. It's the national assessment, and it's the only assessment we have today that really gives us a sense of how we're doing compared to states around the country. This shows you how we did in terms of performance in fourth grade reading over the last decade. As many of you know, we have struggled with African American achievement in Michigan for many years, and that continues to be the case today. Michigan is in the bottom 5 states for African American early literacy, and increasingly Latino students are now in the bottom 10 states in the country, catching up or catching down with African American literacy compared to other states around the country. But for many people, as you all, I'm sure you've heard, many people think that our real struggles for education are often confined to urban areas or for low-income neighborhoods, and that's simply not the case. In fact, we've been projecting that over the next few years, Michigan will become 49th in the country among white students for early literacy. This is a remarkable change when you look back only 12 and 13 years ago, that Michigan was a little over the national average in indicators like early literacy. And so that's the bad news, and there's a lot of bad news right now. The good news is that it doesn't have to be this way. And the good news is that there are a lot of states that we can learn from, and that's really what today is about. Massachusetts, for example, much like Michigan in the early 90s, was undergoing an identity crisis, had been a predominantly industrial state, a textile state, and was deindustrializing, and really had to do some hard thinking about what its future looked like in a state that was no longer going to be able to depend on hundreds of factories to give people good jobs without college and career ready skills. And so Massachusetts has done remarkable work, which we're going to dig into in just a minute. But I want to show you a slide that, because all means all in Massachusetts, and because they've done such great work for all kids, no matter who they are and where they live, The gains that those kids have made have been, that the state has made, has been across student groups, including for African American students. This gives you a sense of how statewide strategies can lift all boats and can lift all kids in terms of student achievement. This is from also what's called the TUDA. It's from National Assessment Data, and it shows you where Detroit was performing compared to low-income students in Boston. The difference, if you think about it as a mom or as an educator, as I often do, the difference is almost 3 years of instruction. That's devastating when you think about that's by 4th grade, and you think about the cumulative effect of that for a child, right, that's going through the K-12 system, the cumulative effect of how many years our kids are behind simply in the instruction that they've been given, right, in the opportunity that they've been given to learn over the case of their K-12 career. This also gives us a sense of not only where Michigan's been losing ground for early literacy, but also where states like Massachusetts, like Tennessee, which is actually now our fastest improving state for early literacy. Tennessee is now leading the country in indicators like 4th grade reading compared to other states around the country. So with that, let me introduce our guest, and let me put my glasses on to do so. I'm really particularly delighted that Sarah Hayburn, who's really a leader in terms of school talent in Tennessee, has joined us. Sarah assumed the role of the executive director of the Tennessee Board of Education earlier this year. In this role, she works with the 9-member governor-appointed board on policy review and development across all areas of K-12 education. She first joined the state of Tennessee in 2010 as a K-12 policy advisor in the governor's office. Over several years, she served as an assistant commissioner of teachers and school leaders at the Tennessee Department of Education, where she directed policy and implementation related to increasing teacher and leader effectiveness for public schools in their state. She began her career as a high school English teacher, something that we share, and a cross-country teaching coach. She's also a national board certified teacher and completed her BA from the University of Virginia. I'm also very happy that Mark Hill, a Michigan native, and a Kalamazoo native, in fact, right? We always liked Michiganders when Michiganders come back, is joining us today as well. Mark is the Chief Policy Officer at the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce, where he leads the organization advocacy efforts to create a policy environment in which businesses can prosper. Previously, he served as the Chief Education Officer for the Chamber, leading the organization's efforts to improve public K-12 education in Nashville. Previously, he served as the Director of the Mayor's Office of Children and Youth under Nashville Mayor Bill Purcell, and he also was the Mayor's Special Assistant for Education. Mark is going to really speak to how the business community can play a really important role in improving public education for all kids. And also with us today, the very distinguished Paul Revel. Paul is the Francis Keppel Professor of Practice and Education Policy Administration at Harvard University. He's also, for those of you who may be familiar with some of his newer work, he's now the founding director of the Harvard Graduate School's Education Redesign Lab. He recently completed nearly 5 years of service as the Secretary of Education for Massachusetts. As Governor Patrick's top education advisor, Revel established a new Education Office of Education and had oversight of higher ed, K-12, and early education in the nation's leading student achievement state. Previously, before joining the Patrick administration, he had chaired the Massachusetts State Board of Education, and he also co-founded the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education. Particularly relevant for our conversation today, Paul was one of the leading architects of the transformation plan for the state of Massachusetts when it really, I think, was when it really committed to the long-term haul that was needed to take Massachusetts from where it had been into becoming the top education state in the country today. That was in the early 90s. So Paul, Would you like to kick us
Sure,
off and
sure.
tell us a little bit about Massachusetts' story?
Thank you, Amber, and thank you all for being here. It's an honor to have an opportunity to address you. I thought I might start, if it's agreeable with you, Andrew, just going through a few slides that
Sure.
talk a little bit about this journey that we've been on in Massachusetts and a journey that I've been privileged to be part of every step of the way. I begin this with a sense of humility, that we're very proud of what we've accomplished in Massachusetts. We are also highly conscious of the fact that we didn't get to where we set out to go. We set out to eliminate the correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment. We didn't do that. We've made good progress. We're happy with the progress, but doing well, as Governor Patrick and I used to say, is not good enough. And so I spent a lot of my time thinking today, what are the lessons that we've learned from the 25 years of education reform in Massachusetts, and where do we need to go in terms of the future? Why are the things that I'm about to tell you about necessary, but probably not sufficient if your goals are the same as our goals? And our goal, I best sum up in terms all means all. We want to prepare all of our children to be successful. An unprecedented aspiration for any American public education system, and one that, frankly, we just weren't built to accomplish in our current way of delivering education services. So I'm going to look in the rearview mirror a little bit here and tell you how we got started on the pathway that we've taken that has brought us where we are today, but in all humility saying that while these things were necessary, they clearly weren't sufficient to where we need to go. And so I hope that part of our conversation will also encompass how do we build on this set of strategies to do the things that we need to do if we're to build a sufficiently robust system to deliver on that audacious promise of all means all. So we can, this is our MCAS scores, and you can see how they track. The green is science and technology, the red is math, the blue is English. We've got steady improvement across those sectors. I have another slide that shows 5 administrations of NAEP in the 4 areas that Ken mentioned, 4th and 8th grade, English and math. We have been first in each category, all 5 administrations over the past 10 years. No other state has done it once. We've done it 5 times in a row. So as I say, we're proud of that. There are a lot of work went into that. We're proud of these international rankings. You saw some of them in earlier slides. This is just another representation. We won't go into the details. But we've come a long way. We were in the middle of the pack. And these strategies that I'm describing and talking about today have taken us from the middle of the pack, comparatively speaking, to the top, at least as far as averages go. But as you know, all these rankings are computed on the basis of averages. And beneath those averages lie deep, persistent achievement gaps. And so if we go back to the MCAS test, you can see the Asian is the top line, white is the sort of gold line. Take a look at the green line. That's the low income line. So a consistent gap in the percentage of students above proficient. Making progress. We're gradually moving northeast, but still big gaps. Here's another example, and these are, there are thousands of examples we could give, but just taking the grade 3 MCAS results from 2013, and when we look at proficient at higher, white students at 65%, low-income students at 34%. In math, 73 to 49. At grade 5, 72 to 46, 67 to 41. So gaps of, by a factor of 2 here. So this tells us we're not where we intended to go. Here are other representations of the gaps. The dropout rates. For black males, 5.4%. For white males, 1.8%. Hispanic, 6.8%. Low-income students, 20% less likely to graduate from high school on time. So I want to be careful to put in perspective the kind of success strategies that I'm going to be talking about. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, as we built a consensus in our state for dramatic action on education reform, these are some of the factors that were at work. We'd had a tax limitation measure in the 80s called Proposition 2.5, which limited the amount of money local communities could raise for any kinds of municipal purposes, including education. And that was basically starving municipalities in terms of their capacity to support schools, which we were heavily reliant on local resources at that time, and so that was a big factor. We had an equity case that had been languishing in the courts for, 6 or 7 years by the time we started our education reform work. People were anxious that we were going to get a decision that our finance system was unconstitutional and would need to be revised. We had heavy business involvement. The business community got very active in partnerships after the Nation at Risk in 1983, and a number of leaders emerged from that period of deep involvement with local schools, but on a classroom basis. And business people went into those schools, saw things that gave them deep concern about the system, about the framework in which schools operated. They became sympathetic to educators. They became cognizant of the fact that the challenges had changed a good deal from when they were in school. And they became sort of urgently concerned about the capacity of the system to deliver a 21st century workforce that would enable us to grow the economy in Massachusetts. So out of that concern, they organized to move beyond partnerships to systemic education reform, and that's when we created the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education. That was the driving force in leading up to the 1993 Education Reform Act. We had executive and legislative leaders who wanted to do something about education, but weren't really sure what to do, so that when a business community came along with a plan, they were ready to receive it. And finally, in the end, we made a grand bargain. We had a field that was eager to be refinanced because they were starving. This included superintendents, school boards, unions, et cetera, and willing to trade a refinancing of the system in exchange for accountability and a variety of strategies for improvement. Here are some of the concerns, and I won't, given the limitations of time, go into it in great detail. But what business people saw when they looked at our schools in the mid-'80s was a clear lack of goals. In other words, everybody seemed to be trying to achieve something else. Nobody quite knew what the goals were. There were a lot of rhetorical goals, but no performance measurement system against any goals, no HR system. You could come in at age 22 and as a teacher and be doing the same job 43 years later when you retired at age 65, so there was no career ladder. Very uneven performance in a system that they would never have tolerated in their businesses. Educators on the front line who felt totally unsupported. A finance system that was irrational from any sort of standpoint of what was needed to get the job done, to build the capacity to get the job done, and a total lack of any competition, choice, incentives for improvement. So that led to the formation of the Education Reform Act of 1993, which was all about what many states during that period of time did. Standards, assessment, and accountability for the first time in our sector. A whole set of system improvements ranging from increased power for school superintendents to parent advisory councils at schools to charter schools for the first time. And then finance reform, adequacy and equity reforms. We doubled the state commitment to public education in Massachusetts over a 7-year period in real dollars. Some of the contributing factors to our success in implementing education reform, and I can get into the strategies later on if you're interested, but number one was deep, nonpartisan, persistent leadership from the business community, from the executive branch, from the House and Senate. We heard talk this morning about paddling in the same direction. We were paddling in the same direction. There was an overriding commitment, a deep belief that education was the key to Massachusetts' future. That not unlike Michigan, in Massachusetts, we've got a tough climate, a high cost of living. It's not the easiest place to do business. And the only reason that businesses are going to expand or choose to locate in our area is going to be brain power. That we're smarter than other workforces, that we can solve problems that others can't. And there was a visceral belief among leadership in both parties, in business and in government, that if we were going to get ahead in the economic sense, we were going to have to do a better job educating our students. There was from the beginning a clear, powerful equity and excellence argument. We heard again an admonition today to think about equity. From the beginning, our business leaders said this is not just an economic matter, this is a moral issue. And we have to do better by educating all of our children, and that's in our interest financially as well as the right thing to do. And so we ought to have excellent schools for everybody. We set high expectations. We set the nation's highest expectations, and we put real stakes. Some states did high standards and low stakes, or high stakes and low standards. We did high and high, and that was a big part of our success. We made, and I'm proud of this, a significant investment in building capacity. And I think this is something I'll probably wind up talking about later on today. You can't ask people to do a job that they've never done before, educating all people for success, when we used to have a system that educated only an elite few for success, without giving them the added capacity to do that work. So we made an investment. As I say, we doubled our state financing for public education in a very progressive formula over a period of 7 years. We had an inclusive implementation approach, which is not to say we didn't have differences and fractures between our community and lawsuits from time to time and a lot of rhetoric and problems, but in general, we determined to do education reform in Massachusetts with the field, not to the field. And that made a big difference. People support what they help create. And people in Massachusetts working in the field had a sense that they were part of education reform, and so had a sense of ownership about it, even if they didn't buy the whole package. And finally, there was persistence about this. People were in it for the long haul. So lots of key strategies here in terms of building the sort of momentum for reform and things that we did, and I'm not going to go into each of these because we don't have time. But this gives you an idea of some of the things that were really important in our success. We still have big challenges ahead. So we've got those gaps that I spoke about. We've improved at all levels. Our lowest performing kids do better than the lower performing kids virtually anywhere else, but it's not good enough. And we're still looking at that. Early literacy was mentioned earlier. You saw Tennessee's tremendous improvement in recent years. We can't boast that kind of improvement. We need to do better there. We're making progress on turnarounds. Frankly, nobody historically has done very well on turnarounds. We have the first district in the country now that has been taken over by a state which is showing dramatic progress on academic results, and I'd be happy to talk about that if you're interested. And we're having better success with individual schools as well. The career readiness goal is important for us to think about. We have the top sort of STEM scores, if you want to look at standardized tests, in the nation, but our kids on average are less interested than others around the nation in going into STEM careers, which suggests we're doing a good job at educating them but not at inspiring them, and that's a problem, so we need to look at that. We've got issues with time. What we are asking schools to do, and I think this is generally true now, happy to talk about it more later, is it would consume way more time spent in a different way than what we currently have. We're trying to get people, everybody, to world-class standards in a few subjects, give them a well-rounded education, give them 21st century skills, be attentive to social and emotional learning, and address all of society's problems from obesity to violence to driver education, nutrition, and medical care, and do it in the same box that we were given in the early 20th century. It doesn't fit, it's not working, it's not going to get us to all means all. So that's a problem that we've been working on. And we've totally underestimated, I would argue, the impact on poverty on our ability to be successful in schools. Not making excuses, not saying that demographics ought to be destiny, but arguing that looking at the macro data, we've got an iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment, and until we face that straight up, we're never going to get to all means all. Okay, so that's it for sort of an intro, and I'm happy to sort of exchange and have questions afterwards.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. So Sarah, I'm wondering if you could give us a brief overview of and we'll kind of dig into some of this in a minute, about what the theory of action and what the work has looked like in Tennessee, particularly over the last 12 to 13 years when you guys have, seems like you've gotten a lot more serious about your commitment and your focus. And then Mark, if you could speak to the business community's role in that and really the importance in keeping it going and the leadership.
Sure, and I think my mic is on. I want to say thank you to Amber and to everyone at Ed Trust for facilitating this conversation today. It's always exciting to hear from leaders like Paul and work state to state with the leaders in Michigan. I think we like to talk a lot about how different our challenges are and how specific things are in Tennessee or Michigan or fill in the blank. But I mean, I was listening to Paul speak, and a lot of our challenges are so similar, and the strategies that we employ could be more similar, I think, if we're listening and learning from one another. So thanks for the chance to be here today. As some of the slides and the comments already have indicated, Tennessee, I'm proud to say, is a state that is on the move. We have made some historic progress over the last number of years, and I think we've got a long way to go, and I'll talk about that a bit in my comments, but we're proud of the progress that we've made in a relatively short amount of time. We are now, as folks have mentioned, the fastest improving state in the nation according to NAEP, which is the national measure of state progress. We are also becoming a model, I think, for offering additional assistance for students beyond K-12. So we are now one of the first states to offer 2 years of tuition-free community college or technical school for all of our students. And we're really actively engaged in moving our students beyond graduation from high school as the benchmark, because as we know, looking at some of our data recently, that is not the goal or the end goal. And we're also now, for the second year in a row, and I know Mark will probably speak more to this, the State of the Year for Economic Development and New Job Creation. So again, nothing really in education is in isolation. It's all connected to our economic workforce. It's connected to our higher ed faculty and the schools around our state that are both training teachers and also taking our students once they graduate. So we really have to think about this with a broad lens when we talk about education reform. So again, as I was thinking about what to share with you, my questions, if I were you, were what have we done? What has changed? How have we made such progress in the last few years? And we have to constantly sort of stop and reflect ourselves. So this is a great chance for me to do that with you this morning. But I think, it has not been rocket science. It's been a lot of hard work, and we've gotten lucky on a few big grants in terms of being able to put forth a plan that people felt confident they could fund and support. But it's been a lot of hard work, and it's been a lot of commitment from leaders and educators across our state. We've been fortunate to have 2 governors in a row from 2 different parties who have really prioritized education. Not just doing lip service, but really putting money and putting talented people at the state level on these really challenging issues of education reform. So it has been, as Paul mentioned, a long-term commitment for our state, not something that was sort of a fly-by-night effort. But we've also really focused, I think, on a few key elements of the education system that have shown to have an outsized impact on student achievement. So I want to talk a little bit about what I think, again, we are still doing and constantly reflecting ourselves on what's working, what needs to be changed, where do we continue to focus. But 3 things that come to mind. First, Paul mentioned this, but I think this is true for us as well, high standards for all students. It's hard to get success if you don't have high expectations and really have concrete standards that articulate rigorous academic expectations for all students. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. The other, and this one is closer to me in terms of my former work with teacher and leader effectiveness, but is really focusing on the nucleus of any education system. At its core, it's a student and teacher connecting in a classroom, and we have to honor and really focus on that nucleus as we think about system level changes. So we'll talk more about how we're trying to differentiate supports and feedback for teachers in a way that I think really has made a meaningful difference in their ability to deliver high quality instruction for all students. And then third is sort of at the system level, we have not been afraid to fail fast and constantly improve. I think it can be really daunting at the state level to think about taking on these major efforts and initiatives, not knowing really when you're jumping off the cliff what you're going to find as you parachute down. And so being clear on the front end that we're going to do everything we can to study and constantly improve and do that in a public and transparent way. Again, I'll talk a little bit about our first year of teacher evaluation in just a second, but we learned a lot about failing fast and constantly improving at the system level, knowing that everything really needs to be a work in progress. So first, and just briefly, again, on the higher standards, this began in earnest back in 2007 when we got a big wake-up call in the form of an F in Truth in Advertising from the Leaders and Laggards report, which some of you may be familiar with. It's put out by the National Chamber. And it said that in Tennessee, again, according to NAEP and according to our state tests, there was a major disconnect. Our state tests were telling us that nearly 90% of our students were proficient and advanced in math and language arts. And on NAEP, it was closer to a quarter, 25%. And so that was a big wake-up call because we were kidding ourselves to think that on our state tests, our students are doing fine, and then on the national measure of progress, they are not even close. So that instituted a number of major changes, first with the American Diploma Project and higher standards in the form of what we called Tennessee Diploma Project. And that was a really important shift in our expectation for students that happened back in 2009 as a result of that 07 report. That was in 08. Then on the heels of that, when we applied for the Race to the Top application in 2010, we moved to the Common Core state standards, which we felt further advanced that sort of effort to raise our standards. And we're now in the process of actually going back with our educators and reviewing and refining those standards. So again, a work in progress, but always keeping an eye towards rigorous expectations for all our students. And Paul made this point very clear, and we believe it has to be all students. You have to think about early interventions, and we have RTI that's being scaled up in our state, one of our big initiatives to make sure that at an early age, all students are getting the interventions that they need so that we can keep them on track to meet those higher standards. The second thing that I mentioned before that I think, again, is one of the keys to our recent success is a focus on teachers and the supports that they need. And acknowledging that teachers, like our students, need differentiated supports. They are not all the same. They are not cogs in the wheel. But we need to treat them as professionals and give them the respect that they deserve through systems that honor feedback and differentiated support. Teacher evaluation can get sort of a bad name, and certainly we had a hard year that first year when we were implementing because people feel threatened when you start to talk about performance and evaluation. But at its core, I think what our evaluation system has been able to accomplish is to ensure that every teacher in every classroom across Tennessee is getting feedback about their instruction using a rigorous rubric that articulates what excellent instruction looks like. So we now sort of have a common language for what instruction should be when it's done well. And that they're accountable for student growth, that there's some sense of urgency for each teacher to move those students forward regardless of where they enter the classroom each year. And that should not go underestimated. I think that is one of the major pieces of the movement that we've had in Tennessee that has really gotten traction and that teachers have been able to embrace now in terms of continuing to refine that system. This is a key example of my third point, which is that you have to fail fast and be willing to improve and know that as much as we will try out of the gate to get these things right, we have to have a flexible approach to system level improvement and to be serious about the data and the research and the feedback that we collect at the state level to improve those systems as we implement. The best laid and best intended plans are never perfect out of the gate. And so I think with teacher evaluation, we learned that in a very real way and created a model there for other major reforms where we're out collecting feedback. We're looking to partners to help us through the chamber, through SCORE, which is a coalition of education advocates in Tennessee. We need to hear from our educators regularly about what's working. We need to take that feedback seriously, as well as the data that is associated with, in this instance, teacher evaluation. And then we need to report publicly and regularly on what we're seeing and what changes we're going to make as a result of what we're seeing. And what we found in Tennessee is that model really helps to sort of diffuse the tension that people feel when you take on these audacious goals and big reforms. The second year of implementation of teacher evaluation, if I can stick with that example, was night and day different from year one because we had listened, we collected a ton of feedback, we put out a report, we worked with our General Assembly and with the state board, at the time I was at the Department of Education, and we made the changes to the system that needed to be made. And we've continued to do that over the last few years as we've continued to implement that system and modify it. So in closing, before I pass over to my colleague Mark, we are really proud of the progress that we're making in Tennessee, but we also acknowledge that we are far from finished. We've gotten recently, through some of the final Race to the Top dollars, a P20 data system that allows us to look beyond high school graduation and see how our students are doing post-graduation. And it's some of the most sobering data that we've had to look at and wrestle with in recent years. For instance, just a few sort of nuggets. Nearly a third of our students don't go on to any post-secondary at all. And we know that their earnings, if they go on to no technical school, no certificated program, are roughly $9,000 a year, well below the poverty line. And for our students that do go on to some sort of post-secondary, only half of those students are still enrolled after 1 year. So we have a huge attrition problem. We have great remediation rates that need to be addressed. We have to sort of re-norm what the goalpost looks like, and it's not high school graduation. We really have to take seriously this idea of incenting students to go beyond high school. So hence the 2 years of tuition free and some of the new work around what we're calling our Drive to 55 initiative. We want to have 55% of our population with a college degree by 2025. So I'll stop there. All of this work has such implications for our economic workforce and whether our students are able to really become the workers that we need to be a state that continues to stay on the move. So I'll pass it back over to Amber, who I think will then.
So thank you, Amber, and the Education Mid-Trust for bringing us together today. It's true, I did get educated grades K through 4 in the Kalamazoo Public Schools. I was then moved by my family to Nashville, against my will, I might add, to Tennessee. But I've been there since 1979, so at this point, Tennessee and Nashville is a wonderful place to be a part of, but it is special for me to come back in a small way and be part of this conversation about how to improve education in Michigan. So I'll talk a bit about the business community's role. So there's really two pieces of this, and I imagine I'll have an opportunity to circle back on the state policy work that we do, which is considerable. But it's important to remember, and even as Tennessee's statutory framework is largely built out around the reforms that we want to accomplish, it's now sort of about defending that, and it's really about implementation, which means how do you push this down at the district and school level and the classroom level and make it real in the field. And I think that's where community organizations and business community and chambers can really make a difference. So I'll give you sort of 3 ways that we do that in Nashville, Tennessee. We have a large urban district of about 85,000 students in a consolidated city-county government in Nashville. And that urban district, it has struggled historically. In fact, Nashville, Middle Tennessee is one of the fastest growing regions of the country, and a lot of the growth in our surrounding counties, frankly, has been around the inadequacy of our public school system in Nashville. And so we, as a business community, have made improving education our top priority at the Chamber, which is a little remarkable. That's not usually the #1 priority of chambers across the country, improving public education, but we take very seriously our responsibility and our role to do that. And we really think about it in 3 ways. So we focus on improving education through politics, policy, and program. There's sort of 3 pieces to our work, and I'll sort of go through an example of each of those 3. In the political realm, if you will, not in a partisan way, but we have gotten involved in school board elections. We believe that leadership matters. That shouldn't surprise you from the business community standpoint, in that the Board of Education, who is at the top of that hierarchy in most education systems, really does matter how they function. And so back in the late 90s, our chamber formed a political action committee that just focuses on school board elections, recruiting candidates to run, helping them get elected, and then obviously working with them after they get elected. And back then, nobody was really paying attention to school board elections other than our friends in the unions, which was their right. We don't begrudge that. But our business leadership at the time said, we need a group focused on electing people who focus on student achievement as the #1 reason of why they're wanting to serve on a school board. And not only that, folks who understand their governance role as board members. So we are still at that. There's an election every 2 years for 4-year terms on our school board, but 6 of the 9 current school board members have been endorsed by our political action committee. On the policy side, starting about 20 years ago, we started doing a report card of our school system. So I've got a copy of it here. This is completely produced in-house by the Nashville Chamber. It's done every year. We assemble a group of 25 business and community leaders who serve on a committee that will meet just about 6 months out of the year. Every Friday, they'll interview everybody from teachers and principals to the superintendent and the mayor. And they will compile all the data and charts on student achievement. We do an annual public opinion poll as part of this report card that's unique to that tracks public perception of our schools each year. And what maybe makes it increasingly relevant and valuable in an age when we're inundated with reports and data is that it also is a narrative of how our schools are doing. What are the successes? What are the challenges? And then there are 5 recommendations for improvement, which is really a platform for us to advance policy ideas and ideas for improvement. And then we'll follow up each year on whether those 5 recommendations were implemented or not in dependencies. So we'll ask the school system to respond a year later, what did you do on these? Why or why not? And tell us why. As an example of some of those 5 recommendations, they're often directed at the school board and the superintendent, as you might imagine, or the mayor, but sometimes they have state implication as well. So a couple of years ago, we focused on charter schools as a special area of study as part of the report card. And we recommended a new state law called default closure, which is basically that if a charter school is in the bottom 5% of our state schools, they'd be automatically have their charter revoked. So we wouldn't leave it up to local discretion to do that. So it took us 2 years to pass that law, but that's something that came out of a report card as an example. And so that's a policy piece that we have. And then finally, programmatic. We are partners, arm in arm with the school district, in reforming high school education in Nashville. And this is sort of a value of accountability, and having a robust accountability system is that we all can think of probably 5 things that were wrong with No Child Left Behind. Educators can think of more than 5. But it did force schools to change. And back in 2006, our zoned high schools, which were most of our students attended, were our schools of last resort. They had not changed much in decades, and to the credit, 8 of those 12 principals said, if we don't radically change what we're doing in high school, we're going to get taken over by the state, we're going to lose our job as principals, something bad's going to happen. And so they looked around the country and sort of found the career academy model as a way to get kids more interested in their studies. And you talked about this, is how do we ignite that love of learning and that interest on the part of students? And so the decision was made to go wall to wall on all 12 of these high schools with academies. So every student would be in a career or thematic academy. It might be a health care academy alongside an information technology academy alongside a business academy. And so we began that journey back in 2007. And the nice thing about the academy model is it doesn't really work without authentic and robust business partnerships. And so the district not recognized they weren't experts in how to do that. They asked the chamber and other community partners to get around the table, and we designed a system of business support. Because if you think of 12 schools, and every school has more than 3 to 5 academies, and every academy ought to have several business partners, you're now into the hundreds of business partnerships, which was unprecedented. Previous to this, our high schools might have had 50 business partners across those 12 schools. We now have over 350 individual partnerships between businesses, post-secondary, and those 12 high schools, and that grows every year. Whereas previously, those 50 business partners, half of them would go away at the end of the school year because they were frustrated and there wasn't anything meaningful for them to do. We now have 95% of those 350 partners re-upping after an academic year as far as renewing that partnership. And those activities are everything from executives coming to interact in the classrooms and speak to students, to hosting teams of teachers in the workplace during the summer called externships, where teachers are seeing how their academic standards in math, English, or science are how they play out in the real world in that business setting. And then that team then develops a project that they bring back to the school with those students the next school year, and businesses are helping to deliver that project alongside of them. And I'd be remiss if I didn't reference, Ken, our partnership with Ford Motor Company funds Next Generation Learning, who works with communities that are doing this model to scale. Nashville was their first model community, and there are several communities in Michigan that are looking at this. But that's a way that businesses and communities can really get involved on the ground with our schools and school improvement. So we feel it's important to have all 3 of those elements in our work at the local level, at the regional level, and then that helps educate and sort of inform us as we work with partners at the state level to push that framework as well.
Thank you so much. Just a reminder, we are going to be collecting cards shortly, so if you have questions, jot them down. We have paper and pens on the table, and we'll be asking for those in a few minutes. So let me start off by kind of a broad question for Paul, and before we dig into some of these particular strategies, but for Paul and Sarah. So as you may know, you can imagine, Michigan has a very strong tradition of local control, and I know in your states you do too. So, but in a lot of ways, you had to rethink that tradition in order to do some of the work that you've done. So tell us about how you've reimagined the role of the state, and in ways that you haven't reimagined it, and why has state leadership been so critical to the gains across all kids in your states?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think we have taken a very different approach at the state level over the last few years, and it's been pretty intentional. One thing that we recognize is that, again, I mentioned before, education at its core is a micro operation. It's, the classrooms within schools, within districts, within communities across our state. And so to forget that misses the mark in terms of how we work with districts. On the other hand, where we're trying to go is very similar across districts, across schools. So having some very clear objective goals as a state, and then also trying to provide the best resources possible so that we're providing support and accountability, but giving a lot of discretion and control to local districts about the specific left-right kind of how they do things. So I think that tight-loose approach is something that we feel is continue to be important in giving districts flexibility to implement with strong resources and support, but also accountable for very clear goals. And so again, differentiating where we see districts that need more attention and more help. Teacher evaluation is another example. We don't have many state requirements for things that happen based on evaluation data. We've redefined tenure, so there are some sort of elements of tenure that are defined at the state level. But besides that, districts use those results to drive human capital decisions and other teacher leadership work. However, if scores look too off in terms of observation and student growth, we give the optional support of coaches to go in and help people get back on track. So it's those kinds of strategies where we're really looking at data, we're really clear with our districts about what we expect, and then if things are wildly off track, our Achievement School District is another example where the schools that are in the bottom 5% are either taken over by the state or have additional local resources that have to be put into those schools. So I think it is sort of a light or loose, tight approach that we found to be most useful there.
I think in Massachusetts, you have to go back to the fundamental logic behind the set of reforms in the first place. And it's interesting to track the thinking within the state and then think about our current discussion on Common Core nationally. And here the business community, I think, was critical in helping us think through. They're striking the right balance between local control and state leadership. So the business community implicitly recognized that while we have 350 cities and towns, and probably as many when you include different kinds of districts, maybe 400 different school districts, that ultimately the children were all citizens of the Commonwealth and that they were going to move. And therefore, it didn't make sense for us to have very high standards in one place where an A meant a significant level of mastery, and then in another community, maybe 20 miles away, very low standards where an A meant something that most of us would regard as deficient. So it was the business community driving a logic that we've got to prepare all these kids to be part of the workforce, because if we don't prepare them, we're going to be carrying them. And so therefore, we're going to need state standards. And with acknowledging this sort of tight, loose distinction, that we'll be clear on the what, but open-minded about the how. So we'll clarify what it is you need to achieve, and you can use your local discretion, your professional judgment as to how to get there. If you don't get there, we will give you guidance and support. You'll lose some of your autonomy over time. But basically, we're setting the target, and you describe how to get there. I think that what we did and what Tennessee did was emblematic of what was happening across the nation. This movement to states setting standards fundamentally altered the role of states. And I'm not sure we've still yet quite caught up with building the capacity of the state to execute on that leadership role. That's a huge responsibility, setting the standards, holding people accountable for performance, intervening where help is needed, being a capacity building rather than a compliance-oriented state agency is a huge responsibility. When we did education reform in Massachusetts, we had 500 people at the State Department of Education. 10 years earlier, we'd had 800 people there. Yeah. Arguably, our responsibilities tripled. We still haven't caught up with that because in the end, when in the legislature, if it comes down to $1 on the table and whether it goes to a local community or to a state education agency, most of the time it's going to go to the local community. So I'm not sure we've quite caught up with the recognition of how much capacity it takes at the state level to do the work of high standards for all, but clearly we've made a shift in that direction.
If I could add to that real briefly, because I do think, states often, that whole notion of I'm from the state and I'm here to help. I mean, districts don't often want our help. So I think, also acknowledging where our limitations are at the state level and being really clear and cognizant about where our capacity is and where it's not, and then leading with the willing in the districts that we can support and create pockets of success that then I think another one of the state's roles is to hold up what's working and be really clear about the data-driven sort of research behind the things that we're seeing across the state that are working so that other districts can learn from one another. But I think there's a lot of things the state takes on that we're not often equipped to do well, and so we have to be pretty reflective about our capacity and try to do the things that we think we can do well in service to districts.
We hear that, you hear that a lot in the field in Michigan, and like a lot of states, right? And Tennessee and Michigan are certainly not alone in that. And it struck me that leaders in Tennessee have been really strategic and intentional about finding other ways to provide that capacity, even when the own state can't do it, right? When your equivalent of ISDs couldn't do it. I'm thinking about now around helping schools meet the new standards, helping individual teachers. Tell us a little bit about that and how you tried to figure out other ways that you could augment that support for the field, when you didn't have, say, the expertise in your equivalent of ISDs or in your state department, and how to build that capacity around the new standards. How did you guys do that?
Yeah, I think we have made some strategic investments, and again, there's never enough money in education. That will probably always be true. So using money that we had very intentionally and where we thought we had some high leverage activities that the state could do well. So as we rolled out Common Core for the first time, we knew that our districts, our teachers, needed a lot of help in those early years of implementation to get that right. So we did. We looked for external providers. We used some of our grant money through the Race to the Top to bring in people to help us really get that curriculum and that training right. And then we did a very selective process of bringing in to do the training leaders from our districts, teachers in our classrooms who are going to be sort of the teacher leaders who we could really help to understand deeply these new standards and what it would take to get the teachers in their building and in their districts ready to implement. So it was intentional in that we looked to external sort of providers to help us get that model right, and then we also made sure that it was capacity building at the local level, because it wasn't going to be enough to have trainers doing that without really building a network of teacher leaders who continue to come together each summer. And we have these ongoing leadership courses now that are getting refined each year as we think about the training that teachers need. So trying to build capacity up as opposed to just pushing down.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to that question between state and local control, in the business community, the way we think about it is it's absolutely the state's right or responsibility to define expectations for public schooling. And it's up to districts to figure out how to get there, because every community is unique, the needs are unique, and that makes sense. But taxpayers have a right to know that their money is being spent effectively, and that's where accountability comes in. So I think those are how the three pieces play out from a business standpoint, and it's making sure that you've got that equilibrium across those three pieces.
What you have described is in this focus on teaching and learning is really interesting, and I think it in Michigan, as we began to look at leading state practices, it really began to challenge a lot of our notions about what these big drivers of dramatic improvement really are. Much of our conversation in Michigan over the last 20 years has really been about governance and not about instruction, and yours have been almost exactly the opposite, right? So tell us a little bit about what's behind that. Why have you, in both of your states, there's been so much focus on instruction, and what's your theory of change behind all of that?
Part of it's the nature of the accountability system itself. I mean, that is the sort of beauty of the standards-based reform movement, the accountability movement, because it really judges performance ultimately on student learning. So it drives reform right into the classroom, whereas historically, policymakers and advocates out of school find it easier actually to talk about matters of governance and control, because these are sort of political matters, and they're accustomed to talking about these kinds of things. For example, witness the charter school discussion. The charter school discussion is one that is worthy of conversation. It's a legitimate strategy, but if you were to follow the media, for example, in Massachusetts, you would think everything in education reform is about charter schools, even though charter schools serve less than 4% of the population. But it's an easy story to write about. It's a David and Goliath kind of story, and it has conflict embedded in it, and it's fairly simple to talk about because it's a governance matter in the end. But writing about curriculum and instruction, getting into the skunk works of a school system, and to this fundamental core transaction, which policymakers have seldom talked about, that core triangle that Sarah talked about earlier, between the transaction between teacher and student and curriculum, that's much more difficult to talk about and to exemplify and to give handles. But it's important that over the past 20 years we're talking about it. It's why we're talking about data. You know, we used to in our field say, well, that core is kind of magical. It's intuitive. Teachers are born, they're not made. And that's kind of a black box, and the job of an education leader is to protect a teacher from any interference, any observation, any criticism. Just let them do their thing. You can't imagine that being done in any other field, in medicine or, you know, in this state, building cars. If you were to say to the CEO of a Ford Motor Company, you know, what do you think about the core business of building cars? And he would say, well, we don't really know much about that. That's in effect what we were saying in education. We don't just let it go. Yeah. And so over the past 20 years, you know, we've probed deeply into building teaching as a craft, using data to inform performance, you know, comparing strategies for teaching different subjects to different kids at different stages of their education. And so we're really getting into it, but that isn't sexy stuff to write about and talk about or to develop political movements around. So I think that's a challenge for us.
But it's so important because, as we know from our economy, the consequences of not succeeding now in school now are much different than they were 20, 30 years ago, when you could drop out of school and perhaps get a manufacturing job that didn't require some sort of post-secondary education. Now we know those graduates with just a high school diploma in Tennessee are earning $9,000 a year. And we talk about sort of a national debate about income inequality. Well, it's coming from education and skills development. And we've seen a shift in our economy. It used to be about our members were more focused on us recruiting companies to come to Nashville and Middle Tennessee, and obviously we still are, and that's an important part of it. But now workforce and availability of workforce and skills is the #1 concern over the past 3 years, particularly as it came out of the recession and all these jobs are being created. There's a war for talent, not just within regions or cities, but across states and regions, and we face that. But right now in Nashville, every day, there are between 500 and 1,000 information technology jobs that we can't fill. And those jobs are going somewhere. We'd love them to stay or be in Nashville, but they'll go somewhere else if we don't have the workforce. So it is a real war for talent right now.
Is this the narrative that has been constructed to sexify education in Tennessee? Because there, I mean, really, like, you go to Tennessee and it's incredible, the multi-sector leaders, you know, across the state that are so interested, so engaged, and really knowledgeable. But instruction isn't sexy. So did you have to make that more interesting and engaging for, especially for leaders in other sectors like the business community?
Well, you know, actually most of our hard reforms came during the depths of the recession when workforce availability wasn't the #1 issue on the business community's mind. But I think the business community intuitively recognizes, in Nashville, it's a combination of workforce, but also a civic responsibility and a recognition that communities are branded by the quality of their public school system, and that families won't want to come and live and certainly work and stay in a community if public schools aren't a viable option. So there's always been a recognition of that in Nashville, sort of in our water, if you will, or our DNA, and that's an important piece of it. The business community sort of recognizes the value of this intuitively.
Yeah, and I think our governor, Governor Haslam, has done an excellent job of making that point repeatedly. I mean, he'll talk a lot. I've heard him say multiple times when he'll go to various plants or factories across the state that are bringing good business into our state, that they'll tell him that they can't find employees to do upper-level high school math. So they're, you know, we border 8 states in Tennessee. They're recruiting from all of these other states. So I think there's urgency there as well to get our workforce in Tennessee ready for the demands and the challenge of this growing business community. So no, I do think that is part of the narrative because it's a real challenge.
Let's talk about equity explicitly. Paul, one of the big changes in the transformation plan that Massachusetts underwent included making Massachusetts one of the most equitable states in the country for school funding. Michigan is actually in the bottom 10 states in the United States for school funding inequities. So tell us a little bit about that and really how, as you all know, you hear a lot, especially in the K-12 sector, you can't do it without more money. Right? Or in some cases we hear it's like it's really about the money, and then the other flip side is it's not about the money, right? And it feels like the truth is somewhere in between. So tell us, how important was that in terms of the shrinking of gaps and lifting student learning for kids of color and low-income students in your state, and then maybe you can talk to speak to how Tennessee has thought about equity. Because I think that's a story that we're not as familiar with.
Yeah, there are a couple things going on in terms of giving an honest portrait of what was happening in Massachusetts. One, we had an equity lawsuit that had been pending for some time. I mentioned it earlier, in which plaintiffs were arguing that our formula, which relied heavily on property tax and therefore disadvantaged poor communities, was constitutionally illegal because it didn't provide an adequate opportunity in communities that had low property wealth to educate their children. So that was in the background. But totally apart from that, independently, when we put the business community together and they said, you know, we're going to strive for all means all, for all the economic reasons that I argued earlier. And the job of getting to all means all is going to be much more difficult for educators in Boston or Worcester in Springfield, where they have high concentrations of low achieving children, than it would be in our affluent suburbs to the west of Boston. We're going to have to give them some additional capacity, some additional strength in order to do the job. So we constructed, so that was the basic logic. It was, this notion of reciprocal accountability. So for every increment that I, as your supervisor, raise in terms of expectations for your performance, I have to simultaneously increase your capacity to meet that performance goal. I have to give you something to help you. Yeah, we can't simply by policy fiat say, well, tomorrow we want you to get all kids to proficiency when previously we supported you and gave you a good rating when you only got 25% of kids to proficiency. It's just that, that naturally people in the field would turn to you as they would if you were in a sales force. And if you were in a sales force and you sold 100 widgets a month, and your supervisor, your sales manager came to you and say, we want you to sell 200 next month, and you say, well, okay, I'm working as hard as I could to sell the 100. Now you want me to sell 200. Are you giving me additional sales personnel? Are you giving me a price discount or other incentives to bring customers? Give me something to help me achieve that goal. So I think there was that logic in the business community so that, for example, in the new formula that we wrote, we acknowledged that it takes more time and energy and capacity to educate a low-income youngster. So for every 100 low-income youngsters, our formula allowed for 3 extra teachers. So we got to a foundation budget in local communities where the foundation budget in urban communities was higher than it was in suburban communities. And that seemed logical in the sense of building the capacity to get to all means all. And on the strength of that, we became a state in which, not too long ago, it was the case that our 25% most affluent communities were spending less per pupil than our 25% poorest communities. But that seemed an appropriate balance. Still probably isn't tilted enough in light of all the inequalities that exist in children's lives outside of school, but it's a start in the direction of equity.
Just to add to that, I think, as you were indicating, Amber, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Money definitely matters, and having sufficient resources will always, I think, be a challenge in education. But we also have to be strategic with the money that we do have at any point in time. And I think while it's looking at the funding formula, it's thinking about, your high-need students and what do they need in terms of hard and quantifiable resources. Another way that we've started to think about equity, and it comes back to sort of, again, that nucleus of who's in the classroom with these students who are farthest behind. And this is reflected in our equity plan that we submitted to the federal government recently, is to, again, use some of the performance data and the other metrics that we have about teacher performance and see access and equity there across our districts and our schools. Do students of color, students with special needs have disproportionate access to highly effective teachers? And that's been really interesting data for us to examine, and we're working on human capital reports for the second year now that go out to districts that help them to look at equity gaps in terms of access to effective teachers. Because while we need to continue to fund infrastructure in schools and buildings, more than anything, we need to make sure that our students who are furthest behind have access to great teachers. That's the only way we're going to ever close our achievement gaps. So that's been important to begin to really look at that data as well.
And that is in part driven by the data system you have in place.
Right, our evaluation system that again, I think another theme that I've heard Paul mention as well for the state is to collect data that can help you understand your challenges and give supports to districts where they need them. Without that data, you don't really understand the extent of your challenges.
The one of the pieces of the grand bargain for the more money, for the more investment in Massachusetts was that in return for that, that there would be more accountability for school performance.
Right.
And my understanding is that the business community really had a hand in making sure that that accountability was meaningful, and as you said, that it was high stakes. But it also came with greater supports and funding. This year, we're expecting a big shift at the federal policy level, and that over the next several months, we're expecting, if it goes through, ESCA to go through, right, and that states will be much more positioned or will have to be much more responsible for what school accountability looks like in a way that they hadn't been in the No Child Left Behind era. In Michigan, we hear a lot from policymakers that are skittish about investing more in strategies when the sector as a whole is doing so poorly, right, compared to other states. So what are some, do you have any advice, things for us to think about as we think about school accountability and sort of the next era of accountability, right? And what do we need to think about, especially as if we think also about capacity building and investment, right, in strategies that are actually meaningful and effective at improving things like instruction?
I think we have to be careful that we don't, we're great at these bipolar, dichotomous arguments in education where we go from one extreme to another. So now there's a reaction against federal involvement in accountability systems, and so the tendency is to go to the opposite extreme and say, well, let's abandon those systems altogether. Let's not have any testing. Let's go back to the good old days when things were presumably equitable and excellent when we all know they weren't. So I think that's a temptation and a risk. I think that the fundamental logic that brought the business community to the table as well as the education sector to the table in the grand bargain in Massachusetts was to say, if we agree in the field, which we usually do, that we need greater investment, the only way we're going to do it is if we prove to those who are going to finance the investment, policymakers and taxpayers, that the money will be well spent, that it makes a difference, that it will result in improvement. The days of just trust us, we're good people, doing the best we can with the kids that we get, and what do you expect? After all, those days are gone. You can't any longer say, I taught it, they didn't get it, so I'm moving on. It's now, I taught it, they didn't get it, I better figure out how to teach it differently and better the next time. So that logic, that's a fundamental cultural change. I think the argument still prevails today. That is to say, if we believe that education is critical to the advancement of the society, the economy, and to the individual's health and well-being, we're going to have a strong education system. If that requires an investment, and of those of us who believe that investment is going to have to grow, we're going to have to do more in early childhood, we're going to have to do a better job by our teachers and helping them develop the capacity to attain the standards we want. We're going to have to think about some of these issues outside of school, like out-of-school enrichment, which varies so tremendously between wealthy kids and poor kids, or access to health and mental health services. It's going to require bigger investments to get to all means all. So if we want to make those investments, we're not just going to get it on faith. We're going to have some accountability systems that are sensible, not that are sort of overly focused on extremely narrow goals, but that are sensible and speak to the academic achievement and the health and well-being and prosperity of our children. And I think that's the challenge in the future as we go forward.
We're going to be moving on to questions. Kathy, do you want to do that now? Should I do one more question or not?
One more, and then we're going to get to questions. I've got some in my hand.
Charter school quality and accountability, big topic in Michigan over the last few years. Massachusetts has one of the, it may be actually the highest performing charter sector in the country. I showed one slide just showing how Boston's doing compared to Detroit. We know that the charter sector in Boston is actually performing at that very high, similar level as traditional Boston public schools, including for low-income students. Can you tell us just a little bit about what do you think has been helpful in driving the success of that sector, particularly for low-income students? And because charters are predominantly in low-income areas,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, acknowledging I'm wading into a treacherous area here. I know there's diversity of opinions in the audience on this, but our model has been, we have a state authorizing process. It's a very tight, highly controlled, deep authorizing process. The notion behind charter schools in our state was these were new schools, laboratories of innovation that were an added cost to the state. We were capitalizing a new system. We actually reimbursed districts for the lost students for a period of time. So it was more expensive to have charter school than not to have a charter school. And therefore, if we were going to spend taxpayers' money on this, these schools were going to have to perform at least as well as other schools serving the same students, if not better, in order to maintain their charter. So there's a very deep scrutiny that happens for anybody to get a charter school that comes before the State Board of Education. And it's actually a challenge for the State Board because there are lots of schools that come forward. It takes up a lot of the State Board's time to do that, but the department does very good staff work on that. Then you get the charter, you have it for 5 years, there are regular checkpoints, and we're very strict on authorization and regulation of charter schools as they go forward. They have to add value in terms of contributing to student performance.